Oh, hello there, yes. It's the weekend, albeit rather a damp one. We'll see what happens at the cenotaph today. Doesn't really matter what happens at the cenotaph today, of course, because our right-wing media pundits across the board will simply blame certain people for it. Turning Point, who's seem to have been jumping up and down about the fact that they're in charge, are suggesting that they don't want any Nazis or National Front types. Our ancestors fought the Nazis, and those who support this twisted ideology are as bad as Hamas supporters, which personally I thought was a bit telling, because of course Turning Point are those types. Exactly. We also have a lie which will carry on being repeated, which is that next weekend's actual Remembrance Weekend, which follows the 11th, is on Saturday, and Remembrance Sunday is the Sunday the 12th. So we've got Andrew, Tory boy Pierce here. When will police ban the anti-Israel march on November the 11th close to London's cenotaph? It's inflammatory and runs the risk of being hijacked by fanatics who despise the nation's tribute to the fallen, which includes many Muslims. Now, he's really letting the side down there, because if you're going to inflame racial tensions on the streets of London, you don't want to acknowledge that people who aren't white have actually done something. But of course, any march that takes place won't take place at the cenotaph, and it won't be at the same time. So that isn't really a thing. But nevertheless, the marchers will all be pro-Hamas. I guess that will also include the Jewish people that are marching, who need to be protected. I'm getting confused now, because it's reality, you see. When we're binary, it's nice and easy, but unfortunately people don't fall into binary categories. You will notice the whole UK Hamas supporter thing, because anybody that goes out on a march calling for a peace in a war which appears to be obliterating vast sections of the Gazan civilian population must be a supporter of terrorists, by definition. Again, one of those binary positions. We also have Douglas Murray, naturally, who really does push the envelope in terms of credibility. Hamas supporters are now planning a 1,000,000-man march on Remembrance Day. They plan to defame our war dead and desecrate the cenotaph itself. This is the tipping point. If such a march goes ahead, then the people of Britain must come out and stop these barbarians. Yes, you see, in order to reduce racial tension, what Douglas Murray is calling there for is for people to come out on the streets and basically, form a kind of nice old-fashioned 1950s style race riot, whereby they beat up people that he doesn't like. I imagine that he'll be safely ensconced still in New York writing this, because that's what the posh boys do, isn't it? Oh, you can do that. Yes, the man's such a stunning intellectual. But the biscuit for me over the last few days has been Darren Grimes, because of course, the bear with very little brain has to just, try and keep up with the actual adults in the room, and always manages to get it wrong. So we end up with things that are absolutely, just laughably ahistorical, and even genetically, I would argue, wrong with Darren Grimes. My great-granduncle Peter Grimes was killed on the 1st of July 1916 in France. Okay, that's the Battle of Somme. See, I know my stuff. It's Battle of the Somme, and yes, he may well have been, okay? However, Darren, if he's your grand uncle, he doesn't realistically share very much DNA with you. I mean, it's kind of like fourth cousin territory. So he's not really an ancestor of yours per se. But okay, if you want to, obviously, in this situation, it's useful to have an ancestor that you can actually sort of put your arms around, saying about and imagine about what they like. I don't think that when he was posted to fight to France to fight for our freedom. So Darren is now imagining what was going on in his great granduncle's head, who and any cursory glance at the history of the First World War, Darren, will tell you that the soldiers there weren't fighting for freedom. It wasn't freedom. Okay, they weren't going to get anything at the end of it. There were no homes fit for heroes. Okay, in the Second World War, the British government had to bribe the British public and gear them up to the notion of a better war afterwards. Because, drum roll, after the First World War, Darren, where your great granduncle died, people felt they'd been dumped on by the government and were absolutely determined that nothing like that was going to happen again. Might come back to that concept, and that's why they voted out Winston Churchill before the end of the Second World War. History fans, Darren. He reckoned that freedom that was there so activists could take to our streets. Right, okay. He reckoned something, because Darren, even though he died decades before Darren was even thought of, Darren knows that he reckoned that freedom was there so activists could take to the streets. At which point you have to say, great then. So when he went over the top in 1916, imagining him as an infantryman and was machine gunned or mortared or something else deeply unpleasant, a bit like what's going on in Gaza at the moment, then his last gasping breath as he waved his Tommies on, probably passing on the football that they kicked amongst themselves and all that other rubbish, right, was that people should be able to take to the streets, yeah? I guess. Freedom something. Don't know. Anyway, to call for the genocide of the world's single Jewish state. Now, at this point, of course, you end up with Darren having to imagine that his great-granduncle, trying to get that correct, that one, could, in his dying breath, imagine the notion of an Israeli Jewish homeland state, which happened in 1948. You know, it's a bit later, sort of 32 years later, but I'm sure that was the case. And obviously he died in the first day of the Somme in order to stop the genocide of a group of people in the future that isn't happening, because the word genocide is quite nicely emotive. Patently, there isn't a genocide going on inside what Israel would currently regard as its borders. You can use these very emotive words as you want, but what Darren, of course, is doing here is he's basically hijacking, as the right always does, this notion of what the significance of Armistice Day is. And, drumroll, fact fans, it changes over time. If you go back, links below, and have a look at the stuff that was going on in the 1920s and well into the 1930s, the whole point of it was that it was the war to end all wars. Right? Huge peace movement, large numbers of women marching for peace on a very regular basis. You know, those lefties who were presumably pro-Hamas supporters and wanted to genocide a state in 40 odd years. I'm not really quite sure about that, Darren. And then later on, it has, as the First and Second World War generations have gone. Yeah, my father included, who went 1939 to 45. As that generation has gone, and the actual things that they fought against, my father was a avowed anti-fascist throughout his life. He indeed saw fascism firsthand during the Second World War and before fighting the fascists in the streets of London, so he knew what it was about. Yeah? These people, you know, gave sacrifice, a horrible word, this notion of just deliberately throwing yourself on the fire, but they gave themselves in order, yes, in that case, for a better future, one which Darren and his paymasters have really sold us down the river on. And of course, now the cenotaph is simply used, and Remembrance Day is simply used as a glorification of British power, because it's rather embarrassing after all, isn't it? Because if we think about recent British military history, let's say in the last 20 years, we end up with some very, 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 very dodgy ideas relating to what states should do to large groups of civilians in other countries. And that, in essence, is the history that Darren isn't very keen on. He hasn't got a genetic link to that knowledge. Anyway, do have a lovely Saturday. Do stay dry. Do stay away from the cenotaph. There will be a lot of very, very nasty individuals there. Most of them from Turning Point. Not Dougie Murray, though. Not him. He won't get his hands dirty. Anyway, do have a lovely Saturday. Arr.